but I'll try to speak slowly, and in the discussion afterwards, we can do questions in English, French, or slow Italian. In this paper, I would like to focus on some aspects of Spinoza's conception of religion in his masterwork, the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, which I'll call the TTP. The TTP is a curious work. At the heart of the TTP is the interpretation of Scripture. Other themes that are important to the TTP are the denial of miracles, the separation of philosophy or science and theology, and the relationship between religion and civil society. The crowning argument, though, is for freedom of thought and freedom of speech, and in particular, the freedom to practice different religions. At the end of the preface to the TTP, Spinoza writes, and this is text T1 on your handout. Next, because men vary greatly in their ingenium, and I'll explain in a few moments what ingenium means. Because one is content with these opinions, another with those, because what moves one person to religion moves another to laughter. From these considerations, I conclude that each person must be allowed freedom of judgment and the power to interpret the foundations of faith according to his own ingenium. We must judge the piety of each person's faith from his works alone. In this way, everyone will be able to obey God with an unprejudiced and free spirit, and everyone will prize only justice and loving kindness. And this is a very interesting passage. The key to understanding Spinoza's thought here, I think, is the word ingenium. The word is virtually impossible to translate into any modern European language. In his excellent new translation of the TTP into English, Edwin Curley translates it as mentality. I don't like that translation very much. I would prefer, perhaps, temperament. In his magisterial Spinoza, l'expérience et l'éternité, Pierre-François Moreau translates it as complexion. In English, constitution, or perhaps disposition. Peter, what do you translate that in your translation?
I think indole, natura. I don't remember.
Indole, natura. Yeah, but it's very difficult. There is not a word in any modern European language that really corresponds to exactly to the term ingenium. But none of these translations that I know really capture the complexity of the notion. So as not to have to use, to make a bad choice, I'm just simply going to leave ingenium in the Latin and talk about what it is that it means. On the handout, I give the translation that is found in the standard English, Latin to English lexicon that people use, Lewis and Short. But it is no more satisfactory. Ingenium, as Spinoza uses it, and actually what's interesting is Spinoza's use of it is a little different, I think, than some other people's use. Ingenium, as Spinoza uses it, is a cluster of intellectual, cultural, and religious attitudes that we bring to religion, among other domains. A person's ingenium might involve religious doctrines or practices, whether you prefer the Latin Mass or the Lutheran service or the Hebrew Saturday morning prayers. Spinoza claims here that people do differ in their ingenia, and so can do so while being equally pious. For that reason, he argues, we should allow people with different ingenia to practice religion as they would like, as long as they agree in the essential practice of reason, which, according to Spinoza, is to love your neighbor as yourself and to love God above all. And so in my paper this morning, I would like to unpack some of these ideas. And in particular, I'd like to understand for Spinoza where ingenia come from and how it can happen for Spinoza that people equally pious can differ in their theological beliefs and practices. What this will show, I think, is how Spinoza conceives social, political, and historical factors that to play a central role in religious practice. And in fact, I'll argue at the very end that what's interesting for Spinoza about his conception of religion is that religions are really historical and cultural entities that are the product of the common sort of historical and cultural experience of groups of people. So they are, in a certain sense, not given to us directly by God, but they are created out of human experience, which is, I think, a very interesting conception of religion. So, let me begin by saying a bit more about Ingenium in Spinoza. The notion of Ingenium is, first of all, applicable to individuals who will characteristically differ from one another in their ingenia. Returning to the passage from the preface to the TTP that I began with, and this is again the first one on your handout, T1. Men vary greatly in their ingenium, because one is content with these opinions, another with those, and because what moves one person to religion moves another to laughter. One's opinions are obviously an aspect of one's particular ingenium, but there are other elements of ingenium as well. In Ethics Part 3, ingenium comes up in a very interesting context. In Ethics 3, Proposition 31, Corollary, Spinoza writes, quote, "Each of us strives so far as he can that everyone should love what he loves and hate what he hates." From this, Spinoza concludes, quote, that each of us, by his nature, wants the others to live according to his ingenium. And that's we all want other people to share our ingenium. It's also, there's actually a very interesting tension there, because also in these propositions, Spinoza says, we tend to imitate other people's ingenium. So on the one hand, we want other people to share ours. On the other hand, we have a psychological tendency to share other people's, to sympathize with other people and adopt their perspective. And there's a very interesting tension there that I think Spinoza was completely aware of, the complexity of human beings in that respect. But each of us, by his nature, wants others to live according to his own ingenium. In this way, one's loves and hates. But here he's talking about we want other people to love what we love and hate what we hate. And in this respect, one's loves and hates form a part of one's personal ingenium. More generally, the individual ingenium seems to constitute the complex of personal beliefs, tastes, prejudices, and the like, whatever it is that makes any individual person the particular person that he or she is. You know, the things that they love, the things that they hate, the prejudices that they have, the beliefs that they have. And to bring it back to religion, the kind of religion that they find, kind of religious practices that they find conformable to their tastes and the ones that they don't. All of these are elements of what it is that make up the individual as a particular individual as they look at the world. And that is what Spinoza seems to have in mind by Ingenium. This sort of complex of beliefs, prejudices, tastes, and so on. But where do these individual elements of one's personal ingenium come from? Well, literally in the Latin, ingenium would mean inborn. The nature that we are endowed with at birth. And no doubt, some basic elements of our personalities and temperaments do come to us at birth. But there is nothing to exclude some things coming to us from experience as well. And in fact, one can say that the ingenium is sort of a combination of the two. It arises from our inborn qualities as they develop in reaction to the world around us. Our experiences can and do give rise to every variety of states, loves and hates, attractions and repulsions, beliefs and prejudices that shape our, what you might call, temperamental landscape. Though somewhat complex, the idea of ingenium as it applies to an individual person is relatively straightforward. And I think that we can all understand what it is that Spinoza is getting at. And Spinoza, of course, did not invent the idea of ingenium. There is a tradition, but nevertheless we can understand what it is that people meant by that. But what's interesting here is that Spinoza also recognizes that groups of people can be said to have ingenia as well. One example of such a group, ingenium, collective ingenium, you might call it, emerges in Spinoza's discussion of the Hebrews. There are some other places that it arises in the TTP as well, but one of Spinoza's concerns in the TTP is the history of the Hebrews. And there's a story there. I think the Hebrews were among the Dutch Calvinist ministers thought of as the model for society. And what Spinoza is trying to do, and the idea is if you read the Bible, in the Protestant way, and try to take the Bible as the model for your society and your political organization, the model of the Hebrews is obviously very, very much present. Spinoza's argument in the TTP is largely the Hebrews certainly are interesting, but they are particular people who develop in a particular historical circumstance, and their laws and customs and so on reflect that, and they should not be, they're not intended as a model of anything. But in any case, Spinoza talks about an ingenium in connection with a group of people like, for example, the ancient Hebrews. And one of the themes that goes through the TTP, of course, is the history of the ancient Hebrews. They're coming out of Egypt. They're developing religious and political institutions. And one of the things that Spinoza notes again and again with respect to the ingenium of the Hebrews is their stubbornness or their obstinacy, contumacia in Latin. And at one point, in the course of a discussion of their ingenium, Spinoza writes, and this is T2 on your handout, now we must ask why the Hebrews so often failed to obey the law, why they were so often subjugated, and why in the end their state could be completely destroyed. Perhaps someone will say that this happened because the people were obstinate, but this is childish. Why was this nation more obstinate than others? And this obstinacy is a property that will go to the Ingenium belong to the Ingenium of this group of people. Why was this nation more obstinate than others? Was it by nature? Surely nature creates individuals, not nations. Individuals who are distinguished into nations only by differences of language, laws, and accepted customs. Only the latter two factors, laws and customs, can lead a nation to have its particular ingenium. A nation has an ingenium, just as individuals do, in its particular flavor and its particular prejudices. So if we have to grant that the Hebrews were more obstinate than other mortals, we must ascribe that either to a vice of the laws or to a vice of the accepted customs. So the particular ingenium of the Hebrews derives from their laws and customs, Spinoza claims. But where do the laws and the customs come from? One important feature of the account of religion in the TTP is that the laws and customs specific to one people or another, and to one religion or another, don't come directly from God. Quote, divine law which renders men truly blessed and teaches true life is universal to all men. So what really comes from God is something that is equally well shared by everybody. So if we're looking what differentiates one group of people from another, then we're not going to look to divine law, but to something else. Spinoza argues instead, laws and customs are the result of common historical and political experience. As Spinoza argues, customs and ceremonies, quote, contribute nothing to blessedness, but only concern the temporal prosperity of the state. So all of the things that differentiate one group of people from another have to do with a particular historical and political, economic, social conditions that this group of people may share. Interesting here is Spinoza's analysis of the early years of the Hebrews when they left Egypt and entered their new home in Israel. This is what Spinoza says about their condition at that moment, and this is T3 on the handout. When they first left Egypt, they were no longer bound by the legislation of any other nation, so they were permitted, as they wished, to enact new laws or establish new legislation, and to have a state wherever they wished, and to occupy what lands they wished. Nevertheless, they were quite incapable of establishing legislation wisely and keeping the sovereignty in their own hands as a body. Almost all of them were unsophisticated in their ingenium and weakened by wretched bondage. Therefore, the sovereignty had to remain in the hands of one person only, who would command the others, compel them by force, and finally, who would prescribe laws and afterwards interpret them. Okay, and that one person was, of course, Moses. Moses was a very clever leader, according to Spinoza. Moses established the laws of a state, but wanted to do so in such a way that, and this is from T4, that people should do their duty not so much from fear as voluntarily. And so Spinoza continues, that's why Moses, by divine power and command, introduced religion into the Republic, so that the people would do their duty not so much from fear as from devotion. He also placed them under obligation with benefits, and in the name of God promised them many things in the future. And this is the way in which, for the Hebrews, religion and politics, from the beginning, come together as a single entity. Moses, as the ruler, as the one who is organizing the state, organizes it around, as a religion, and speaks to the people with the authority of God. And religion and politics are mixed for the Hebrews in the beginning. And the circumstances in which the Hebrews found themselves, newly freed from slavery, gave rise to some very specific laws. And this is, I think, a very interesting insight. This is T5. In order that the people who were not capable of being their own masters should hang on the words of its ruler, that's to say Moses, he did not permit these men, accustomed as they were to bondage, to act just as they pleased. For people could do nothing without being bound at the same time to remember the law and to carry out commands which depended only on the will of the ruler. For it was not at their own pleasure, but according to certain and determinate command of the law, that they were permitted to plow, to sow, to reap. Likewise, they were not permitted to eat anything, to dress, to shave their head or beard, to rejoice, to do absolutely anything, except according to the orders and commandments prescribed in the laws. This was not all. They were also bound to have on their doorposts, on their hands, between their eyes, certain signs, which always reminded them of the need for obedience. So in this way, Spinoza argues the Jewish dietary laws, laws about permissible clothing, laws about how it is that you could cut your hair, the custom of what was called the mezuzah and other such customs are, Spinoza argues, not eternal commands from God for everybody to follow, but rather ceremonies and customs that are specifically relevant to the Hebrews and to their needs, as newly freed slaves. And this is and Spinoza concludes this discussion with the following passage. This is T6. This then was the object of the ceremonies, that men should do nothing by their own decision, but everything according to the command of someone else, and that they should confess, both by constantly repeating actions and by meditations, that they were not their own master in anything, but were completely subject to someone else's control. From all this, it is established more clearly than by daylight that ceremonies contribute nothing to blessedness, and that those of the Old Testament, indeed, the whole law of Moses, was concerned with nothing but the Hebrew state, and consequently with nothing but corporeal advantages. The basic idea here is that the Jews had come out of Egypt. They had been slaves in Egypt, and they were incapable of dealing with the freedom. You know, what am I going to wear this morning? What am I going to eat for breakfast? How should I cut my hair? When should I plow? And so Moses set up a system that said, okay, this is what you should wear. This is what you can eat. This is what you can't eat. This is when you should plow. This is, and here are some rituals that you should perform so that you will always remember that you are subject to laws and that you are subject to be obedient. And so, in a certain sense, took these people who were, because of their slavery, where they had been constantly told what to do all the time, and their lives were constantly directed by other people, were incapable of sort of living with a freedom, and gave them a structure to their lives. And that, Spinoza says, is the origin of the laws of Deuteronomy that governed the Hebrews when they came out of Egypt. So the point is, these are not universal laws that govern everybody, that are intended to govern everybody. As, for example, the Calvinist ministers might have said, you know, it says in the Bible you should do this, therefore we should do this. No, what Spinoza says, what you read in the Bible is the report of what Moses told the Hebrews that they should do at that particular moment in their history, because of the particular historical circumstance in which they found themselves, which is a very interesting way of sort of reinterpreting laws and rituals, not in terms of a God who gives them to everybody, but in terms of laws and rituals that are appropriate for a particular group of people in a particular historical circumstance. Okay, so the Ingenium of the people then is going to be a consequence of the laws and customs and not part of their inherent nature. But as we've seen, the laws and customs and ceremonies themselves result from the particular needs of a particular group of people in a particular historical circumstance. Right? So the Ingenium that results, the resulting Ingenium in the Hebrews at that particular moment has to do with their common historical experience and the particular needs that they had at that moment. It's not something inborn. It's not something that they will share with other groups of people who may have different historical experiences and therefore other particular needs at a particular moment. And from this it follows that the Ingenium of the people is a consequence of historical circumstances. But once a particular Ingenium is acquired by a group, it can, in good part, determine important features of the culture of a people. And so writing again about the Hebrews, and this is the T8 on the handout, reason teaches as clearly as possible how much of all of these things, freedom from human domination, devotion to their country, and absolute right in relation to all others, a hatred not only permitted but even pious regarding everyone as hostile, the particularity of customs and rites, reason, I say, teaches, and experience itself has been a witness how much of all of these things would strengthen the hearts of the Hebrews to bear everything with special constancy and virtue for the sake of their country. While the city was standing, they would never endure being under the rule of a foreign power. That's why they frequently called Jerusalem the rebellious city. So their stubbornness, in a certain sense, was said to derive from, again, this historical experience. And I'm going to skip over a little bit here. In this way, historical experience determines the Ingenium, and the Ingenium in turn shapes what we might call, in a very broad sense, the form of life of a group of people. So we've gone from Ingenium of an individual now to the Ingenium of a group of people. Before moving on in the argument, I'd like to pause over what is perhaps a subsidiary issue. One of the standard questions that's arisen in the commentaries on Spinoza's Politics is the question, is the status of societies, republics, or other organized groups of people like the ancient Hebrews. Individuals, the notion of an individual has a special place in Spinoza's metaphysics. They first enter explicitly in the Ethics in a short digression on actually physics. And there they're defined as a collection of smaller parts. An individual is defined as a collection of smaller parts that maintains a constant organizational pattern of motion and rest. The parts maintain a constant pattern of motion and rest with respect to one another. And such, so for example, human being, each individual human being is an individual. In that sense, the individual parts may change, but the structure of organization, Spinoza conjectures, remains the same throughout your life. And I have one, and each of you has your own particular one that's remained constant from the time that you were a baby, as long as you live. And such collections of parts have a certain stability. They have what Spinoza calls a conatus, or an endeavor to persist in their existence and to resist being dissipated. But most notably, I think it is these individuals, defined in this technical sense, that have minds. So anything that is a genuine individual in this sense, Spinoza argues, has a mind. And since people, individuals with minds, are the kinds of things to which individual ingenia are usually attributed, there's a great temptation, I think, to see the attribution of ingenia to collectives as requiring that they be treated as having minds and being individuals in this technical sense. So the idea is, well, each of us is an individual, but insofar as we belong, for example, to a particular common society, that common society constitutes a higher order individual. That's the claim. And just as we individually have minds as individuals in this technical sense, so the society as a whole can be said to have a mind. And just as our individual minds are characterized by our ingenia, you can say the same about, say, the collective mind of Italian society or Roman society or something like that. And this has been, I think, a very attractive idea. But while the temptation is strong, I'm really not sure that it's really necessary. While having a mind and being a genuine individual does indeed provide a natural foundation for attributing an ingenium to a group, I'm not sure it's necessary. To understand why, let me turn briefly to another figure important for the history of the notion of an ingenium. A medical writer from the 16th century named Guarda de San Juan, who may have been known to Spinoza, who wrote a treatise on ingenium. That's actually very interesting. In his treatise on ingenium, he too attributes ingenia to groups of people. And Huerta's conception of ingenium is based on a Galenic theory of the humors. He holds that the balance of the four humors determines the ingenium of an individual. And in that way, the ingenium turns out to be a matter of the physical makeup of the individual. But because on Huerta's medical theories, humors are changed by things such as diet and climate, a group of people who eat a similar diet and live in a particular climate together can exhibit the same ingenium, and by changing their diet or changing their climate can change their ingenium together, but it's still the individuals and their particular balance of humors. The society as a whole doesn't have Galenic humors, but each individual does, and by virtue of doing the things that will change the balance of the humors by diet, climate, exercise, things of that sort, individuals can change theirs, and if a group shares these qualities, and each of the individuals in the group changes their ingenium in the appropriate way, then the group as a whole will change their ingenium in a particular way. Now, Spinoza certainly doesn't have a Galenic theory of the ingenium, but suitably adopted, I think this conception can be translated into Spinoza's terms, and understood in that way, a group can be said to have an ingenium by virtue of the fact that each of its members shares a common property. And so you don't need to think of the Hebrews or the Romans or whatever as constituting a genuine individual with a common sort of group mind. It's enough that each individual share the appropriate properties, and it's enough for Spinoza, I think, that each individual share the common history, have participated in the common history to constitute a common group, Ingenium. Okay, I've talked a lot about Ingenium. Let's now examine the step from the fact that different peoples have different ingenia and therefore practice different kinds of rites and ceremonies in connection with their religion, to the conclusion that the religions of different kinds with different beliefs, rites, and practices should be tolerated. Remember, this was part of an argument for toleration. Since groups of people have different ingenia, they should be allowed to practice different religions. How does that argument go? Well, the argument from toleration in Spinoza is actually rather complicated. Like Hobbes before him, Spinoza believes that the sovereign has the right to determine religious questions with the appropriate theology, what the appropriate theology should be, the interpretation of Scripture, the determination of the appropriate rites and ceremonies, and so on. And the sovereign is the political power. So Hobbes and Spinoza share the idea that the political power determines the correct religion. But even if the political power, the sovereign, has the right to prohibit religions other than what he or she or they determine to be correct, Spinoza still argues that it would be wise and prudent for the sovereign, for the political power, to allow freedom of expression in general, and in the domain of religion in particular. And this, he writes, what we're discussing now is not what their right is, that's to say the right of the political power, but what is advantageous. So the political power has the right to impose whatever they want. On the other hand, they would be wiser if they allowed people freedom. When he takes up the question of toleration in chapter 20 of the TTP at the very end, the emphasis is on the individual and the emphasis is on political speech. Freedom to be able to say what you think about things. But here I'd like to look more closely at the somewhat different argument suggested in the quotation from the preface of the TTP that started my talk at the very beginning. That because people differ in Ingenium and the rites and ceremonies and theologies may differ, people should be allowed to practice religion as they see fit. And here the argument seems more directed at questions of religious freedom rather than freedom of, say, political speech. And also, I would argue that it is also thinking not about the freedom that individuals have to practice the religion they like, but it's also concerned with the freedom to be accorded to organized religious communities. It's one thing to say, you can practice Buddhism, but it's another to say it's okay to have a Buddhist community. And I think that Spinoza is concerned both with the individual and with the existence of, and the freedom for a community of, say, Buddhists, or in the Netherlands, Catholics or Jews, to practice their religion together. So he's concerned with freedom to be accorded to organized religious communities. Spinoza, okay, the question of freedom of religious practice is first discussed in the preface, in the TTP. And Spinoza returns to the question of freedom of religion what is faith and who are the faithful. And he writes, and this is text 11 on your handout. To establish then how far each person has the freedom to think what he wishes with respect to faith, and whom we are bound to consider faithful. Even though we think differently, we must determine what faith and its fundamentals are. So the presumption here is only those who are faithful are allowed the freedom to think and practice their religion. There are standards for Spinoza. Not anything goes in religion, and not just anything that claims to be a religion is worthy of toleration. So the question is, what kinds of religions are worthy of toleration, and how much latitude does that actually give? I mean, for example, in many societies in Europe at that time, there was an established religion, and no other religions were tolerated, period. Spinoza obviously does not want that, but he also doesn't want the situation where just anything is tolerated. Where do you put the boundaries to what it is that's tolerated and why? To address this question, Spinoza turns to Scripture. In a number of chapters that precede the discussion in chapter 14, Spinoza discusses what the true message of Scripture is. His conclusion is that, quote, the purpose of Scripture is only to teach obedience. And this is T12. Scripture also teaches very clearly and in many places what each person must do to obey God. The whole law consists only in this, loving one's neighbor. So no one can deny that one who, according to God's commands, loves his neighbor as himself is really obedient and according to the law pleasant. This is the way he often gives the commandment to which we're supposed to be obedient, to love one's neighbor as oneself. But elsewhere it's a little different. It's to love God above all else and to love your neighbor as yourself. Obedience to these particular imperatives is, for Spinoza, the core of true religion. This is in fact, he says, the only message of the Scripture, the only message of the Bible, is to be obedient. Again, for Spinoza, freedom of religion is not going to apply to every set of practices that may call itself a religion, but only those which promote obedience to these particular imperatives, what might be called moral imperatives. Spinoza would certainly reject, for example, toleration for Satanism, or for what might be called Donald Trumpism, to be suspicious of your neighbors, especially if they don't look like you, and to love money and fame above all else. I mean, that's not, for Spinoza, an acceptable religion, because it is not one that satisfies the obligation to love God above all and to love your neighbor as yourself. Religions for Spinoza, therefore, must for which Spinoza advocates toleration must satisfy a certain standard. They must be good religions in the sense of promoting obedience toward the right imperatives. Let me add just a parenthetical note here. Given that the fundamental core of religion is derived from an analysis of Scripture, it may seem as if toleration would be very definitively skewed to a Judeo-Christian religion. While the TTP is directed at a reader who looks to Scripture for guidance, I think that Spinoza's insight is not limited to Judeo-Christian religions. The commandments to which one must be obedient here, to love your neighbor as yourself and God above all, are derived from Scripture in the TTP, from the Bible in the TTP, but in the ethics something very similar is derived directly from reason. To that extent, one can say that they could be derived independently of any scriptural authority, but I want to leave that aside for the moment. But it does raise a question, the argument in the TTP. Okay, note though that a religion is defined not by doctrine, but by practice. Indeed, the only practice that's relevant to the definition of religion and piety is obedience. Obedience to the moral imperative to love God above all and to love your neighbor as yourself. Obedience is what is central, not belief. But toleration is for thought and for expressing those thoughts. How do beliefs enter here? Well, in chapter 14 of the TTP, Spinoza argues that if you're going to be obedient, then you must have certain beliefs that promote obedience. If you have those beliefs, then you will necessarily be obedient. This is what faith means for Spinoza, beliefs which support obedience. In particular, Spinoza argues that there is a certain minimal set of beliefs which supports obedience to the two moral imperatives, what he calls there the dogmas of universal faith. And this will be a minimal set of doctrines that every good religion, every religion that promotes obedience to the moral imperatives will share. And I give a list of those on the handout on T14. And the basic idea here is very simple. To be obedient to the moral imperatives, we're required to believe that there is a God who has the authority to impose those on us. Now, there is a God who, like a prince, has said, I want you to be obedient to these laws, to love your neighbor as yourself. And this God has also got to have the power to reward people who obey the laws and to punish people who don't. So if you're going to be obedient, now, the only thing the Bible tells us is that we have to do is to be obedient. What do we need to be obedient? To be obedient, we have to believe that there's a God who has given us these laws, who will reward us if we obey them, who will punish us if we don't. Right? So these are beliefs in a way that sort of come with the idea of obedience. And so all religions that count for Spinoza, all that promote the right kind of obedience, will share these doctrines. That there is a God who has commanded us in this way and will reward us for following the commandment and punish us for not. And insofar as they promote obedience, they're all equally good as religions go. Any religion that has these beliefs and promotes obedience is going to be a good religion for Spinoza and worthy of toleration. But though they may share a certain body of doctrines, there may also be significant disagreements between these different religions. And Spinoza writes, and this is on T15, each person is bound to accommodate these doctrines of faith to his own power of understanding, and you can say here to his own ingenium, and to interpret them for himself, as it seems to him easier for him to accept them without any hesitation, with complete agreement of the heart, so that he may obey God wholeheartedly. Everyone now is bound to accommodate it to his own opinions, so that he can accept it without any mental conflict and without hesitation. That's to say, we have these core doctrines, that there is a God who is a lawgiver who rewards and punishes, but they may be supplemented by various other doctrines. The divinity of Christ, the coming of the Messiah, the necessity for efficacious grace, the doctrines of heaven and purgatory, etc. All of these supplementary things can be added in if we'd like, if that helps us to sort of visualize this God and follow that God. Furthermore, even the basic doctrines may admit of different interpretations. As Spinoza points out in this chapter, there are many different conceptions of God. God's nature, the way in which God is a model for life, the way in which God is omnipresent, and so on. If being a Trinitarian helps you, that's fine. If you're a Unitarian, that's fine too. As long as you're obedient to the command, as long as it makes you obedient to the command. Though Spinoza doesn't actually discuss the issue in chapter 14, one might also point out different rites and ceremonies that one might add to the basic doctrines. If going to Mass helps you be obedient, that's fine. If taking communion or confession or circumcision, if celebrating Easter or Passover, whatever added to these basic doctrines helps you be obedient, that's fine. It doesn't affect the core of the religion. So if all good religions share the central dogmas of universal faith that are set out in T14, why do they differ in in these ways from one another as religions? Historical religions obviously do. And to answer this, we must return, of course, to the idea of Ingenium that we talked about a little bit earlier. And this is T16. No one doubts that the common Ingenium of men is extremely variable, and not everyone is equally satisfied by all things. Opinions govern men in different ways. Those which move one person to devotion move another to laughter and contempt. And then T17. Each person is bound to accommodate these doctrines of faith to his own power of understanding, to interpret them for himself as it seems to him easier for him to accept them without any hesitation, with complete agreement of the heart, that he may obey God wholeheartedly. What's important then is obedience, and any interpretation of the dogmas of universal faith, any supplementary dogmas or practices that get a person or a group of people to obedience are equally good and worthy of toleration, even if they lead to beliefs and doctrines that are literally in contradiction with one another. One person asserts the Trinity, another person denies the Trinity. But they're both equally pious as far as Spinoza is concerned, as long as they both agree in loving God above all and loving your neighbor as yourself. When dealing with religious doctrines, truth is not an issue for Spinoza. This is T18. The faith of each person should be considered pious or impious only on account of his obedience or stubbornness, not on account of truth or falsity. And of course, to be efficacious in inducing someone to be obedient, she must actually believe the dogmas of universal faith to be true. But when judging whether a religion is worthy of toleration or not, the only thing at issue is obedience. Truth and falsity are completely irrelevant. For that reason, Spinoza counsels toleration. The differences are unimportant and simply reflect different contingent histories of different peoples. But as long as they all promote obedience to the moral imperatives, they are all in a sense equivalent and equally well worthy of toleration by the state. Now, it's important to note here that the argument from Ingenium for religious toleration is framed equally well for individuals and for groups. On the basis of this argument, any individual is entitled to follow whatever religious beliefs and practices she wants, as long as she maintains obedience to the moral law, to love her neighbor as herself. But the historical sections of the TTP show that Spinoza is perfectly well aware of the social dimensions of religious practice as well. In general, people with similar beliefs and practices come together to form social units, religious communities. These communities, too, are entitled to freedom of religious expression, just as are the individuals who make them up. But Spinoza's reflections on religious communities offer us, I think, a very interesting perspective on the status of historical religions themselves. What defines religion at its core is obedience to the moral imperatives to love your neighbor as yourself and God above all. But the commitment to obedience carries with it almost no cognitive content. Even though it entails belief in certain dogmas, their content is determined almost entirely by the external, historical, cultural, and political circumstances that have given rise to one or another Ingenium in a group of people. This is true even more so for the supplementary doctrines and rites that fill out a religion. While there may be a scriptural or rational core to religion, it is these external and contingent features that largely define individual religions and differentiate them from one another. In a way, one might say that religions are in good part simply contingent historical entities, the concrete embodiments of the contingent historical experiences of their adherents. And thank you very much for your attention.